The press is supposed to be in a constant posture of skepticism, fierce criticism, fierce skepticism, but that is gone now, and the role has been reversed, where they're supposed to be speaking truth to power, but they are defending power to people who challenge it. Democracies only function where there's a free flow of information and where the best governing policies rise to the top in the marketplace of ideas. It was a war on the poor. It was a war on people of color. It was a war on all of our values. It was just one guy, an unelected technocrat who's been there for 50 years, never been in an election. They tell you the only way to survive for you and your children is by complete obedience to these authorities. And the people who are being locked up and abused become grateful to their captors, and they come to see anybody who interferes or criticizes their captors as a dangerous person.
What's crazy to me, Robert, is that I had these discussions in 2020, and yet nobody could even hear that at that point. And a lot of people still don't believe a lot of this assertions you're saying here, but you put all this forward with the science and data as this letter to your liberals.
I don't want anybody to believe what I say. I don't ask anybody to believe what I say or any claims. I say, here's what the science says as I'm reading it. If you see something that I'm not seeing, let's talk about it. Our democracy needs that, and we're not getting it. We're getting one side.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the attorney, environmental activist, author, and nephew of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Your career began as an assistant to the District Attorney of New York in 1983, before you became one of America's leading environmental lawyers and named a Hero for the Planet by Time magazine. You are also the chairman of Children's Health Defense, whose mission is to end the epidemic of children's chronic health conditions by working to eliminate harmful exposures, hold those responsible accountable, and establish safeguards. For the last 2.5 years, your focus has been on the U.S. government and World Health Organization's actions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You believe that scientifically proven treatments for COVID were overlooked in favor of a mass vaccine agenda that has lined the pockets of big pharmaceutical companies and contributed to higher infection rates. As an author, your bestseller, The Real Anthony Fauci, sold over 1 million copies despite extreme censorship and is set to be turned into a documentary film later this year. While your most recent book, A Letter to Liberals, explores the influence Big Pharma had on government mandates and the dwindling values of the Democratic Party. Robert, welcome back to London Real.
Brian, thanks for having me, and thanks again for that really groundbreaking interview that we did in May of 2020, I think 2 years ago, when you were one of the few people in mass media who was willing to look critically at some of the issues at that time. And I think you, at that time, were kind of a skeptic about me and, a lot of the stuff that I was saying. But we had this wonderful discussion there that a tremendous number of people ended up seeing, and it changed a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, it really opened my mind too. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because it was May 2020, very early on. And I want to talk about how it really changed the way I look at things. And I want to jump into so many things that you've been doing in the last 2.5 years. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that we're streaming live now on our Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system built in 2020 that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels, Telegram chats, or email lists? Let me just repeat that. Can everyone watching please share this link now via the sidebar to any and all of your channels? This is important. Simply ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. Robert, I pledge to you and everyone watching this that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anybody in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv. We are forced to stream today on our independent platform because the trillion-dollar technology giants will not publish what we're about to say. And that in itself is very disturbing to me. Here on London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Robert, I'm super excited to have you here today. Like you said, last time was May 4th, 2020. And, I look back on this, Robert, and the title of that episode was My Fight Against Mandatory Vaccinations, Big Pharma, and Dr. Fauci. And again, these are things that people weren't really talking about at the time. People really didn't know much about Fauci. They really weren't thinking about Big Pharma or even vaccinations. They were still trying to digest everything that was going on with lockdown. But you have a history with all of these things, with Fauci, with vaccinations, with Big Pharma. And so strangely, you had already seen, or maybe you could foresee where this was going. And I kind of want to jump into that today. Also, Robert, I'm pretty sure I said on that episode that I was getting vaccinated and then I believed in vaccines. I'm an MIT trained engineer and I grew up on science and maybe I kind of worship science, but you really changed my mind that episode because I just listened to what you said and I had no idea of the history of vaccinations, the government, ways that they indemnify them, etc. So I guess I want to start and just say, Robert, how back in May of 2020, did you already maybe see this coming or watch it happen in slow motion because you knew the mechanism maybe behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, I had that advantage of having watched these characters, basically these captive agencies, and Tony Fauci, who's been the architect of agency capture at NIH and NIAID and even more, all of HHS, which includes the sub-agencies, CDC and FDA. Because he was there for 50 years carrying the water, the way that you survive at that agency is by carrying water for the pharmaceutical industry. The people who oppose the pharmaceutical industry, who ask questions, legitimate common sense questions about pharmaceutical industry products or priorities, are drummed out of that agency, forced out. Famous scientist Bernice Eddy, John Martin, many others, Judy Mikovits, who asked questions and had their locks changed on their offices, banned from their laboratories, whose phones were turned off because they were, pointing out legitimate problems with some of these products. Anthony Fauci survived and flourished at that agency because of his capacity to integrate the priorities of the pharmaceutical industry with the public policies that NIH was promulgating. And so I kind of knew the blueprint. And at that time, by April, I already knew something that everybody should have known, which is that the AstraZeneca vaccine, when they tested it on monkeys, did not prevent transmission of the virus, and that the monkeys, even the monkeys who were vaccinated had the same amount of viral loads in their nasal pharynx as the macaques that were vaccinated. And at that point, I said, well, of course, that vaccine will not make it to market. By May, it was very clear they were going to try to sell it to the public anyhow. And so that was very alarming because they were telling the public, this is going to end the pandemic. And, the scientists at that time, people like Luc Montagnier, who had won the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus and who was on my advisory board, he died during the pandemic, tragically. But they were saying, the leading scientists were saying, wait a minute, if you take a leaky vaccine, in other words, one that does not provide sterilized immunity, one where the virus continues to live in the vaccinated host, what you're doing is you're turning all these vaccinated people into factories for escape mutants, for mutated versions of that virus that know how to escape vaccine. And so you're going to be constantly minting these new viruses, and instead of letting people get the disease, treating them for it so that they don't die, they don't get seriously ill with existing drugs, we're basically creating an endless viral cascade where each vaccine is just going to create new forms of the virus. And this was very clear to people when I talked to you, and they were warning about it. You cannot vaccinate with a leaky vaccine in the teeth of a pandemic. You cannot do that. It's going to make things worse. And that's exactly what happened.
How did everything play out over the past, 2.5 years as you watched it all happen? Did anything surprise you, happen differently? Did it happen too easily? Like what did you see as you watched it all play out?
Well, I never make predictions because I'm not good at it, but I could see kind of the road that we were going down in the direction. And let me just talk for a second about a way that people can understand how bad this was. And that is, we got data now for the Pfizer vaccine, and the way, when they gave these vaccines emergency use authorization, the public really had no access to the data because the company doesn't have to share it except with the regulators. We knew the regulators, who I know are corrupt, were looking at the data and were hell-bent on making sure that this mass vaccination program went forward. And let me step back for a second. You know this from reading my book, that the reason they had to kill the really efficacious therapeutic medicines like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and there's literally hundreds of studies now, peer-reviewed, published studies, including placebo-controlled studies, that show that those medications have a profound impact. They reduce hospitalizations, they reduce serious illnesses and deaths by around 70 to 95%. And we knew this very, very early on. But the government, people like Fauci, had to kill those therapeutics. Why do they have to do that? Because there's a little known federal law that says that if there is a existing licensed drug licensed for any purpose that proves itself efficacious against the target disease, it is illegal to give an emergency use authorization to a vaccine to treat that same disease. So if anybody had admitted that hydroxychloroquine is even marginally effective, it would be or ivermectin, it would be illegal for them to license those vaccines. And that was a $100 billion enterprise for them. And as you know, NIH owns half the patent for the Moderna vaccine, which they put in the front of the pipeline. They waived animal studies, and they're going to get half the royalties. So this is tens of billions of dollars in royalties. And not only does the agency get the royalty, but individuals who work for Anthony Fauci, loyal lieutenants who he designates, are each able, and there's at least 4 and maybe 6 of them, they keep this very secret, they each get royalty, what they call patent margin rights. So they're going to collect royalties of $150,000 a year forever, potentially, from those vaccines. So there's a tremendous amount of money involved, not only and power, not only for people like Bill Gates who invested in those vaccines, but also for the agency and even government officials. Now, here's what we know. We got, when the Pfizer vaccine, BioNTech vaccine got its approval, FDA had to release the data upon which it was basing that approval. So it was the clinical trial data. Here's the first trick that they did, really outrageous. If you remember at the beginning, Anthony Fauci was telling everybody, well, we're going to approve this and we're going to rush the market very quickly. We're going to keep the studies going for 5 years because we recognize that there are long-term impacts from vaccines, dangerous impacts, injuries with long diagnostic horizons, injuries with long incubation periods that you will not see in a month or 2 months or 5 months. In fact, there's a 2002 tape of Anthony Fauci out there right now that says you got to go at least 12 years between the clinical trial and actually mass vaccination programs because there are injuries that do not show up until a decade later. And you could have, in his words, mayhem if you try to move faster. So he said, okay, we're going to do 5 years of study. What do? As soon as they started those clinical trials, they started seeing injuries and they started seeing waning efficacy, very fast waning efficacy. And so they shut down the clinical trials after 2 months and they vaccinated the placebo group. Now that is scientific fraud on its face. The FDA should have marched them out of town if it was a functioning agency and laughed at them. But instead, it granted the license and they ended the study with FDA approval. So now we will never know what the long-term impacts of that because the placebo group is gone. They did that after 2 months. But they then, when they went to FDA to get their license, it's the only one that was approved at that time. They gave them 6 months of data. So even though they ended the study after 2 months, they told them what happened to the people who got vaccinated early and people who got vaccinated late. And here's the key metric is all-cause mortality. It's the only thing people should have really been focused on. And there's a graph called S5 in those, which are now publicly available in Pfizer's submission to FDA. And if you look at that graph and at the language that follows, what you'll see is this. And this is very simple for people to understand. They gave 22,000 vaccines approximately to people in the vaccine group and 22,000 vaccine. And then there were 22,000 people in the placebo group who received a fake vaccine. After 6 months, there was 1 COVID death in the vaccine group and 2 COVID deaths in the placebo group. So that allowed Pfizer and FDA to tell the public that the vaccine is 100% effective, which they did. Dr. Fauci and everybody else said that from the beginning. Gates, the president, it's 100% effective because the number 2 is 100% greater than the number 1. So that was a deception in itself because when most Americans, when they heard it's 100% effective, what they think is if I get the vaccine, there's 100% that I will not get sick. I will not get really sick and I will not die. But what it actually means is that in order to prevent 1 COVID death, they have to give 22,000 vaccinations. And what that means is if you're going to give 22,000 vaccinations to prevent 1 COVID death, you better make sure that that vaccine is not killing anybody from other causes. And there's a graph that summarizes all-cause mortality. So how many people died in the vaccine group during that 6-month period, and how many people died in the placebo group? And in the vaccine group, 21 people died over 6 months of the 22,000 of all causes. And in the placebo group, only 17 died. That means if you want to do, if you want to follow their protocols and their estimates, if you take the vaccine, you're 21% more likely to die over 6 months than people who don't, of all causes. You're half as likely to die from COVID. You're 21% more likely to die from some other cause. And if you want to look closer and say, well, what was killing all these extra people? It was cardiac arrest. There were 5 cardiac arrest deaths in the vaccine group and only 1 in the placebo group. What that means that if you take that vaccine, you're 500% more likely to die from a fatal cardiac arrest over the next 6 months than if you don't. What it also means is that for every life they save by preventing a death from COVID, they are killing 4 people from cardiac arrest. And then if you look at the real world data, and the people who've really done a good job of parsing this are my friend Steve Kirsch, and then, the Wall Street genius at Dowd. I hope you can get those guys on your show at one point. But what they've shown is that by looking at insurance data, by looking at Social Security data, insurance data from all over the world, Social Security data, the mortality and morbidity data from CDC and others, that there's been this huge hike in cardiac arrest death and unexplained deaths. There's so many unexplained deaths among adults that CDC has created a new category of death called SADS, which is sudden unexplained deaths. And the province of Alberta, which is heavily vaccinated, has reported that the highest cause of death in 2021 was unexplained deaths. And this is something and those deaths are happening to young people. COVID kills the elderly near the end of life, but the vaccines apparently are killing people very young. And we're seeing also, there's so much anecdotal evidence. The athletes who are dying, over 1,100 athletes who have died on the field or have suffered cardiac arrest on the field during 2021, the airline pilots who have died in flight, all of these young, healthy people, and particularly athletes who are suddenly dying without any explanation, and medical personnel as well. And the reaction of the media, the social media, and the pharmaceutical industry and the medical cartel has been to censor information about those deaths, to make sure that the public is not seeing what's happening and is not asking questions.
It's fascinating for me to watch. First of all, I'm always flabbergasted to hear about the conflicts of interest going on in these agencies. I mean, is there any other field in government and in commerce where the regulators can take part in royalties for some of these, for some of these solutions? It just boggles my mind that could even be tolerated, and that even individuals could profit from some of these pieces or even have shareholdings. It seems like just a massive, obvious conflict of interest. Does that only happen in the healthcare area? I don't hear of, defense contractors.
There's conflicts in all of these industries, but I don't think there's any conflicts like there is in health. And what you're saying is right. Listen, I brought over 500 lawsuits as an environmental lawyer. Mainly I was representing Riverkeepers or Waterkeeper Alliance, suing the government, suing polluters. Probably 20% of my cases during that 40-year period have been against government agencies that did sweetheart deals that were illegal for polluters who they were trying to do favors for, because the polluters have used all of these mechanisms that result in agency capture. And the agency is supposed to regulate that industry, becoming sock puppets instead for the regulated industry. And that happens, those dynamics are present with every industry, whether you look at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the SEC, the Commerce Department, the Agricultural Department, the USDA is really a captive of big agriculture, of industrial agriculture, and, is crushing small farmers. So you see this everywhere. But with the healthcare, as you point out, it's unique because, first of all, you have agencies that are dependent on industry revenue for their own budgets. FDA gets 50%, 45% of its total budget from the pharmaceutical industry and 75% of its drug regulatory budget. So, I sued EPA probably 30 or 40 times for being captured, for engaging in conduct that showed they were really working for the industry and not for the public health. But imagine if EPA were getting 50% of its budget from the coal industry, it would be impossible. But that's true, and people would laugh and say, "Well, that's ridiculous." The mercantile functions, the mercantile, incentives to that industry are of course going to overwhelm and subsume the regulatory functions, and that's what's happened with the public health agency. CDC has a $12 billion annual budget. About $5 billion of that goes to purchasing vaccines from the people it's supposed to be regulating. So there's all kinds of sweetheart deals, and they set the prices at which they purchase those vaccines, and then distributing those vaccines to the public. So if you're at CDC, you do not get salary raises and promotions by finding problems with vaccines. You get your promotion by increasing uptake, whatever the impact is. Nobody ever looks at the impact. Nobody ever looks at a vaccine and says, is this vaccine killing more people, averting more problems than it's causing? Those studies are literally never done. When they were done in 2017, the Danish government did that study for the number one vaccine in the world, the DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine, and which is banned, not banned, but it's been discontinued in the European countries and the United States, but we still give it, by Bill Gates and WHO give it to 161 million African children every year. And when the Danish government, Gates went to the Danish government to say, will you support this program? We've saved 30 million lives. And the Danish government said to him, can you show us your data that shows you've saved 30 million lives? And they couldn't. So the Danish government funded this massive study where they went to Africa and they actually looked at 30 years of data on the DTP vaccine. And what they found is that girls who got that vaccine were protected against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but they were dying at 10 times the rate of children who were unvaccinated. And they were dying of things that nobody ever associated with vaccines. They were dying of anemia, of bilharzia, of malaria, of just common injuries and cuts. They were dying of mainly of pulmonary diseases and pneumonia. And nobody ever associated the fact, or looked at the fact that it was disproportionately the children who got vaccinated that were dying of all those diseases. And what the researchers concluded is that the vaccine was very good at protecting children from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. So everybody had the illusion that it was working, but that it had ruined their immune systems and that they were unable to defend themselves against these minor infections. And nobody has ever done those studies. Vaccines are immune. It's the only medicine that does not have to do safety studies in order to get a license. So when we sued the federal government in 2018, myself and Aaron Ziri, because for many years I was saying not one of the 72 vaccines that is currently mandated for American children, the 72 doses of 16 vaccines, not one of them has ever had a placebo-controlled study or a study that looks at health outcomes, all-cause health outcomes in vaccinated population against a similarly situated unvaccinated population. Those studies are basic to every other medical product, but with vaccines they're waived. And I've said that for years. Now, one of them has had pre-licensing clinical trials that show the vaccine actually has benefits for all-cause mortality or all-cause health. And Tony Fauci has publicly said that I was lying about that. So I sued him and NIH and HHS, and I said, if you say you got the studies, show them to me. And after a year of litigation on the courthouse steps, they came back and they said, yeah, we've never done one. And so, that's outrageous. Nobody knows what the risk profile is for these products. Nobody can tell you with a scientific basis that these products are averting more problems than they're causing and deaths than they're causing. And that is, and particularly when you're mandating a intervention to healthy children, you want much more rigorous studies, because if it's a medicine, the person's already sick. And so they're willing to accept a higher risk profile because they're already sick. But when you give us something, a medical intervention to a healthy person, that person has no risk from these diseases. And how do you justify that? And then you mandate it and tell the child you cannot go to school, you cannot exercise your constitutional rights unless you submit to this coercion with a intervention that we have never tested properly. It's really, it offends the conscience if you actually understand what is happening. And most people don't, because, of course, the media in our country is an extension of the pharmaceutical industry. There's 75% of advertising revenues now on the mainstream media are now coming from pharma, and that ratio is even higher for the evening news, because the evening news is where you see pharmaceuticals advertised. And, Anderson Cooper has a $12 million a year annual salary. Well, 10 million of that is coming from Pfizer. Oh, his boss is not CNN. His boss is Pfizer. And, they're unashamed, they're unabashed about it. They say, on his program brought to you by Pfizer. Of course, he's not going to tell you the truth about Pfizer's product. He's going to try to sell them to you. He's going to try to scare the hell out of you by saying, if you don't get this, you're going to die. And that's what they did for 2 years, while taking the money from these, very, very, the same companies that brought us the opioid epidemic, that kills 56,000 kids a year, and by the way, if you look at that TV show Dope Sick, which I advise people to go to see, it's on Netflix, you'll see that it was not just the pharmaceutical companies that were corrupt, it was FDA. FDA was pushing opioids for Americans, saying that and allowing the pharmaceutical companies to say they're not addictive. And they were doing it for the same reasons they pushed this vaccine, because they're part of that industry. The mercantile purpose of those agencies has completely subsumed their regulatory functions.
Robert, let me ask you a question, because with the evening news, we can see the direct correlation with the pharmaceutical industry and say what Anderson says. And we know that's where a lot of the American public and the world get their information. The government obviously has its own ties to the business through these health officials. What about big tech? Because I got strike after strike on my YouTube channel back in 2020. I was forced to create this digital freedom platform because we could not stream episodes with you, with all sorts of other people that were saying the same things you were saying. You have been banned, shadow banned, and blocked by Facebook, by Instagram. I watched over the years. How does big tech fit into this whole piece of the pie? Because obviously it's very hard to see a direct correlation. So yeah, how does that work?
There are three reasons why big tech is censoring us, that I can see. One is the technology companies have deep relationships with the pharmaceutical industry. So Google owns 3 vaccine companies. Google's parent company, which is called Alphabet, is a vaccine maker. They own 3 companies that are making vaccines, including, universal flu vaccines and COVID vaccines. And all of these companies make a substantial part of their revenue with side deals with pharmaceutical companies by, one thing that they do is that they're monitoring your health. They're watching you with, Siri and with what you order, and those algorithms are telling them if you're sick, if you're likely to buy a drug. And then they do targeted advertising, and that's a partnership. In some cases, they're actually letting the pharmaceutical company like GlaxoSmithKline has a deal with Google, where I think it's a $76 million deal, where they are actually running part of that, that program to mine the users for medical vulnerabilities that they can exploit. That's one issue. The other issue is that they're under tremendous pressure from the government to censor any information that challenges government orthodoxies. And, I know this because I'm suing Facebook right now, and we're in discovery, and we're very attuned to what they've done. But, Alex Berenson, who used to work for the New York Times, is in discovery and got a document for the same kind of case that they have. And he got a document dump a couple of months ago or a couple of weeks ago that showed that there's been direct communications, in fact, a regular meeting between the big tech groups in the White House about censoring people like me, specifically anybody who's part of the disinformation dozen, which is a group of people that they say, broadcast misinformation. And I want to say this, the outset. The word misinformation, as they use it, has nothing to do with factual accuracy. And they admit this. It is any statement, this is how they define it, that challenges government orthodoxies on vaccines or medical intervention. So anything that diminishes vaccine uptake or that tends to cast the CDC or the WHO in a bad light, or challenges their public assertions, those are regarded as misinformation, no matter what. The factual accuracy is irrelevant. And let me just say this about myself. We have a huge fact-checking department. You mentioned my book. My book is essentially a 900-page book. It has 250,000 words. It has 2,200 footnotes. And a lot of it, and it's been censored. There's also a lot of people, we have to presume, from the industry that are looking at that book and looking for vulnerabilities, looking for places where I made a misstatement. We have a huge fact-checking operation at CHD. We have 320 PhD scientists and MD physicians on an advisory board. Luc Montagnier was one of those who was a Nobel Prize winner. We have the former head of the National Toxicity Program. So these are real scientists, and they look at what I put out and criticize it if they don't think that it's sustainable. So every statement I make in that book is cited or sourced to peer-reviewed publication or government databases. And, we did a good job because nobody has found there's going to be inaccuracies in it. You can't write a book that long and that dense without it doing something. But if there's an inaccuracy and people point it out, I invite people to point them out at the beginning of the book. What is our reaction? Our reaction is not going to be to dig in. It's going to be to change it and apologize and move on. And with the Defender, our newsletter, we probably have the most extensive fact-checking operation of any daily paper now in the country, because nobody else does fact-checking now. And if I was making a lot of mistakes, like really factual errors, none of those people would stay with me. We're very, very careful about it. But what they use that term, vaccine misinformation, not to denote something that is factually inaccurate, but rather something that challenges government orthodoxies. And, that is a very, very odd, as you point out, posture for the press. The press is supposed to be in a constant posture of skepticism towards government, towards powerful agglomerations and of wealth and power. fierce criticism, fierce skepticism, but that is gone now, and the role has been reversed, where they're supposed to be speaking truth to power, but they are defending power to people who challenge it. And it's really extraordinary, and it's not a good thing in democracy, and democracy is not sustainable when you have this level of global media malpractice. Democracies only function where there's a free flow of information and where the best governing policies rise to the top in the marketplace of ideas. And if you stop people from talking about their ideas, it's, what happens? You get a tyranny and totalitarianism, and a uniformity of ideas, which is like a religion. It's not democracy, and it's not science. It's religion. It's faith and blind faith and undeserving authorities, rather than people doing critical thinking, which you need to do in a democracy. So those are two of the issues. Is the government is pushing pressure, and the government has tremendous leverage over these companies because the government itself is threatening to remove their Section 230 immunity, which is an existential threat to those companies. That's the immunity that says you can't sue them for libeling you. So they can print lies and libel and slander about people on their site, and nobody can sue them because they say, well, we're just a kind of a common carrier. We're carrying all this information, and we can't fact check everything. So people have to understand, people are going to be putting things on our site that aren't true, that are misinformation, that are libelous. You can't sue Mark Zuckerberg for it. If somebody puts something libelous about me on his site, I can't sue him. Section 230. And so the government is threatening to take that from them if they don't censor people like me.
Right.
And that's an existential threat. And then the third thing, and I think this is the toughest thing for people to swallow, but you really need to read my book, and particularly the last chapter of the book. But there's a deep involvement of the intelligence agencies in this project. And in managing the pandemic and using the pandemic as a pretense to advance the biosecurity agenda, which is this, ultimately the substitute for the erection of a surveillance state and complete control of the population, which necessarily means the abolition or the diminishment of traditional constitutional rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, jury trials, et cetera, which have all come under attack during the last year. But what I show is a lot of this was purposeful, that they drilled it again and again and again. The CIA drilled it with hundreds of thousands of first responder workers from Europe, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia. And that it has nothing to do with public health. It's about using, militarizing pandemic response, monetizing pandemic response. And these agencies also are deeply embedded in Silicon Valley through In-Q-Tel, which is the investment arm of the CIA. And it was DARPA, the Defense Department, that created the ARPANET in 1989. Or 1979, rather. And then, In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA investment fund, went out to Silicon Valley with both technology and with money and with federal contracts, and invested in some 3,000 companies out there. And the CEOs of those companies signed state security agreements, which means they cannot talk about their relationships with the agency, as a condition for receiving that money.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.